Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I think most of you probably know me, but for those who don't, my name is the Reverend Will Berry, and I'm the Associate Rector here at St. Stephen's. Tonight, I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Jenn Wilhelm, who currently works as an Associate Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology at the College of Charleston, where, among other roles, she serves as the Director of Experiential Learning. Dr. Jenn studied neuroscience during her time as an undergraduate at Davidson College in North Carolina and received her PhD from Emory University in Atlanta. Among other things, Dr. Jenn is interested in the recovery of function after peripheral nerve injury, as well as how exercise modulates the expression of neurotrophins. She will explain to you what that means. Tonight, her lecture is entitled Wonder, Mystery, and the Search for Truth Through Faith and Science, where she'll be discussing how modern neuroscience influences our culture's thoughts about faith and spiritual experience. Dr. Jenn lives on James Island with her family and is also a member of Grace Church Cathedral here in Charleston. Dr. Jenn, we're so glad to have you with us tonight, and I know that Adam is sorry that he can't be here, but is no doubt watching us online. And before you begin, though, let's take a moment of prayer. So God be with you. God of mystery, God of light and darkness, God of order and of chaos, of infinity and intimacy, illumine our minds and open our hearts to hear your wisdom for us tonight, so that we might grow in deeper knowledge of you and of one another. All this we pray in your name. Amen. So welcome, Dr. Jenn.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to get to talk to everybody about something I'm super passionate about. I hope you all have a good time. If people have questions and want to have a conversation while I'm talking, ask. Just stop me. Wave, stand up, just speak, whatever you want. I'd like this to be a conversation with one another instead of me just speaking at people. So, yeah, go ahead. Okay. Does this work a little bit better? Okay. So when Adam asked me to come and speak about reconciling being a scientist and also a Christian, I wanted to spend a little time kind of thinking about this too. I grew up as a Southern Baptist who, I know I see some eyebrows. I am not a cradle Episcopalian. I grew up as a Southern Baptist. I went to Methodist Church. I went to a Presbyterian college. As you heard, I went to Davidson. I have participated in different denominations within the Christian faith and never had really a lot of conflict between my religion and my interest in exploring the natural world. So it's something that I'm really curious about why so many people may experience this idea that there's a conflict between science and religion. So because I'm a scientist, I like data. So I'm fascinated by the world around us, and I like to make observations and then collect those, that stuff and to share what I learn, but I also like learning from other people. So one of the first things I did was to go online and see, is there research that's been done? Have there been surveys done about how many people see conflict between religion and science? What is this conflict that we are perceiving? So I'll get you to turn to the next slide. And I found a Pew Research Center survey that's documented. Their Pew Research Center documents trends every time they do surveys of different people, and they've been looking at trends of people who believe in science or have a I shouldn't say believe in science, but they accept science, and also they look at their religious backgrounds. And one of the things I thought was very interesting is that when you ask Americans, just in general, about if science and religion conflict, that they say that there's actually a pretty big number of them say that there's a conflict. I'm going to leave the mic for just a second. So over here at the top, it's most Americans say science and religion conflict. So when they ask people, do you think science and religion conflict, we have about 60% of people saying that there's some type of conflict between religion in general and in science. When you ask, does science conflict with your own personal beliefs, interestingly, very few people say that broke this down, what they discovered is that people who are the least religiously connected or observant actually perceive there to be a bigger conflict than people who actually are more observant. So people who attend regularly in some type of religious setting in general actually see less conflict between science and religion than people who are not some type of observant of some type of religion. And then they looked at just Christian faith, and they found that most Christians actually do not see conflict between religion and science. So I thought this is really interesting that we have this perception, we have this kind of, in our media we hear about how science and religion are in conflict with one another, but when you really actually talk to people who are Christians, who identify as Christian, we don't have as much conflict as maybe within our own beliefs as maybe one might imagine. So I've been reflecting a little bit more. I said, okay, well, maybe I'm not unique in my experience of not finding this to be as conflicting. But then I started digging a little bit deeper. Why might somebody see that there's conflict? Why might these things be there? And why do I not have as much of the conflict in the way I'm kind of viewing things? And I guess part of the understanding when you talk to scientists, a lot of scientists, when there was a research study done at top research universities, they found that more than 48% of scientists had some type of religious affiliation, and 75% believe that religions convey important truths. So most scientists actually have an okay, understanding or okay interaction with religion. 48% have religious affiliation, of some sort. Maybe not Christian, but have some type of religious affiliation, which I thought was interesting. So I think, asking scientists in general, and my perspective, is that both science and religion have their own unique strengths, and they have limitations. They have triumphs, they have shortcomings, and that, for example, science is really good investigating the natural world and providing empirical examinations and explanations for observable phenomena. But it can't really address some other important questions. For example, we don't have a scientific formula for love. We don't have a scientific formula for beauty. If we did, there wouldn't be all these dating apps out there, that people are trying to use and obviously continuing to pay for. So we don't have these things that science can answer. There are some inherent questions that science is going to not be able to answer. And this is where I see religion and other things in the humanities kind of taking over. So, religion tends to operate on principles of faith and trust and divine revelation, which sometimes don't always align with empirical evidence, but it's not dismissive of that. So it's not that religion has to be dismissive of science and science has to be dismissive of religion. And there is this perceived struggle, and it's not just a current perceived struggle. This is something that we know has existed for a very long time, and we have examples of Galileo and Darwin who have had conflict within the church. But it's also important to remind ourselves that science originally came out of the church. So some of the very earliest scientists were supported by the church, and we have these prime examples of where Galileo had an observation. Their church administration at the time maybe didn't agree with this, with some of the ways that his work was put out, but he was still supported. Had been originally still supported, and the church continued to support science after this. So there's not necessarily this struggle as much, because at their core, both science and religion really are about the pursuit of truth. And if they both seem to seek to answer fundamental questions about our existence and about the nature of the universe. And, it's not, I think really the battle is less against science and religion as to what we hold as kind of our God. So a lot of people now, when I think they are seeing this conflict, maybe they're putting too much trust into science and turning into maybe scientism. So this is the worship of science as the ultimate truth and the ultimate answer, versus looking at science as a tool to observe the natural world and to understand God's creation. So, this is not to suggest that science and religion never come into conflict. I am sure if I asked you to tell me how you see conflict in science and religion, that we could easily come up with a decent list of times where people could say, hey, but what about? What do you think about this? What do you think about evolution? What do you think about free will? There are lots of times in which science has attempted to answer questions that maybe we come up with some answers for that maybe conflict with previous belief. But generally these reasons, or these two different types of areas, they generally deal with different realms, the natural versus the spiritual. And disagreements arise, around the boundaries of where these lie and where they interface. And sometimes one crosses that boundary and makes a claim, and then sometimes we have these times where science actually does support what our religious beliefs are. So they're not always in conflict. And even though we see these, headlines sometimes, it's good to remember that, that there are people who, that really, have been able to reconcile this pretty well. So I think that it's important to think about, how we in our current culture, and maybe I'll get you to turn to the next slide, have thought about science and religion. And this is Francis Collins. He is the director of the National Institute of Health, and started out as atheist and was agnostic, is now Christian, professing Christian. And one of his quotes I like for him is, one of the greatest tragedies of our time is the impression that has been created that science and religion have to be at war. And I think this is really important to think about, that throughout time and culture, people have struggled with the questions of why are we here? And especially for Christians, we like to present ourselves or position ourselves as something as a special creation, a special being, that we were told in early in the Bible that we were created in the image of God. Jesus came to the earth as a human, and that we like to place ourselves as something, particularly special. And there's been a search across time to really understand what makes us special, what makes us uniquely placed, and potentially how we can interface with our world and with God, and trying to understand how that comes about. And I think that, sometimes we have different ways of asking those questions, and that, science is one of those ways that we can look deeper into it. God gave us the ability to be curious. I don't think it's something to be scared of, and I don't think it's something to be embarrassed that humans have a need for proof. We'll talk about, hopefully in a few weeks, whenever we come to the resurrection, we have Jesus appearing to Thomas with the holes in his hands and the scar in his side, and Thomas saying, wait, I need to actually feel it. And Jesus doesn't say, get out of here, I am casting you out. Instead, he says, come feel. And I think that that's included in the Bible, and included what a story it's important for us to think about, because I think it's God's acceptance of our curiosity, of our need for proof, our need for observation, and our acceptance of questioning. And I think that's at the core of what both science and religion do, is that it allows us to question, it allows us to communicate, and that science allows us to have this struggle in kind of the natural world, this physical world, versus religion gives us a different mindset to kind of examine some of the same things. So I wanted to go back in time a little bit, and I hope you'll indulge me. I really like history, and I'm a bit of a history nerd. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of neuroscience and the history of the pursuit of what makes humans special, and our kind of pursuit of understanding our interaction, our bodily interaction with a higher order. Sometimes we'll call this soul, and I'm going to use that term for lack of a better term to talk about this ephemeral thing that allows us to interact with one another, the emergence of consciousness and self. So this emergent property that comes from our body that makes us who we are. We often in our culture call it soul, so I'm going to kind of use that term. I'm coming to why that's not maybe the best term for me to use in a few slides. But I'm going to talk about this kind of search for the soul and how it's really an ancient search. So I'm going to get you to change it. So we have some really early, some really good anthropologists who have gone back and looked at humans across time, and they made some interesting observations. These are some skulls from several thousand years ago. And one thing you may notice is there are holes in them. Here. And here. And the question was, why are there holes? And if you actually look at these holes, and none was alive and that they continued to live after them. You'll also notice that the holes are kind of symmetrically round and probably intentionally placed. These are not holes that you would see if somebody got hit over the head with, something like a big stick. These are holes that look like they were intentionally placed. So the question is, why are these holes there? And while we never really can know, it's likely based on some things that were done at the time, some writings and some other cultural understandings, that this is probably some type of early attempt to let out spirits, to let out some type of thing that they thought maybe was coursing through somebody's body, maybe because the person was dealing with mental illness, maybe they were having seizures, maybe they were having migraines, but there was some type of way that they were trying to deal with some type of interaction, and they were dealing with that through this body part. So this kind of gives us maybe some hope, and Sarah, I'll get you to flip to the next one, that people had an appreciation for the brain as being something that was really important. However, when you start looking a little bit closer in history, we're going to go to Egypt now, and about 2600 BCE, during the 4th and 5th dynasties in Egypt, we're going to start looking at mummification practices. And with the mummification practices, probably in the earliest mummies from prehistoric times were probably accidentally mummified by the heat and dry air and sand and that kind of thing. But eventually the practice became more intentional. And the mummification of Egyptians was done because they believed that people needed certain things to be able to go with them to transition from the type of life that we are experiencing into the afterlife that they were expecting, and that you needed the key things that made us who we are to be able to take with you. So they would prepare bodies for mummification, and they would anoint the bodies, they would wash the bodies, they would then immediately probably stick something up the nose and scrape out the brain and discard it, because the brain was thought to be completely unnecessary for the afterlife. It was then packed with resin because you didn't really need anything up here, and then carefully an incision was made in the side, and Copic jars were created to keep lungs, intestines, stomach, heart, liver. All the other organs were carefully kept and preserved, but the brain was completely discarded. So this, kind of shows that really the brain was probably not something that they were really appreciating as something that was fundamental to human life. So this is kind of an interesting thing. If you'll turn it to the next one. We don't think that the Egyptians, think that the brain didn't have a function at all. They just thought that the heart was more important. And we know that because they had these Edwin Smith surgical papyruses that were about 5,000 years old. And it includes observations about the brain structure and function, and it discusses the effects of damage. It discusses what happens whenever you were to go and poke into the brain. So we know that they had some appreciation for the brain and its function. They just didn't think it was particularly important. They really believed that the heart was kind of the most important thing in the body. And I can ask you, why do you think that they might have thought the heart was the most important? So we'll have some audience participation. Why do you think the heart was where they were looking at? Yes, so that's one of the answers. So you can feel it, right? So you exercise, you can feel it. What else? What else do you think why they thought that might be the most important? They really didn't care about the brain that much. So if you think about our bodies, it's incredibly protected. If we're getting ready to get hurt, you do this. Very rarely, it's kind of weird. Our brain, if it's super important, it's sticking out, unprotected relative to the rest of our body, which has ribs around it, a lot of muscle, and we can then curl up and protect it. Also, what happens if you get cut? You bleed, and then you feel the effects of that. And if you bleed enough, you die. So they can see the blood, right? So you can see the blood, your heart's kind of at the center, you can feel the changes that happen, you can feel the changes happening emotionally. We talk about heartache, brokenheartedness. We have this even today in our lexicon and the way that we speak about things. We'll say, listen to your heart. I don't think we really mean listen to your heart, but we still have this because we feel in this area things that happen to us. If you will turn to the next one. So, the brain has been maybe not quite as investigated for antiquity, and I wanted to look and see, what did the Bible have to say about the brain? And interestingly, it is mentioned 0 times in the entire Bible. The heart, 725 times. So the heart is mentioned 725 times, including today's reading from Jeremiah, which included talking about writing something on the heart and storing it in your heart. Psalm says, teach us that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So often the heart is associated with attitude, thinking, righteousness, and judgment. We talk about store my commandments in your heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't depend on your own understanding. So kind of leading the heart to being where you understand, where you have wisdom, where you have righteousness is in the heart. And this, of course, this is true of the Hebrew Bible and also the New Testament. We have to think about the context in which this is written. So while it makes kind of sense to us, I don't think anybody would argue, hey, this is now not something we want to listen to because you're not literally writing on your heart. We also understand what this means. But the context in which this is written is, a very long time ago. The Hebrew Bible, a lot of it was written during the times of Moses and afterwards. And if you think, Moses was actually educated in Egypt. So Egypt was a lot of the store of knowledge and education. So a lot of the things that we have in our Hebrew Bible and we have in the New Testament are really influenced by this former Egyptian conversation. So when we talk about the seed of the soul, and we look to the Bible for that, it's going to say here. It doesn't say here. That doesn't dismiss that here, we can now understand that here is important. It's just that we now, have a different understanding. And I think that, God uses the language of the time period in which his people are to communicate with them. So we talk about the parables and Jesus coming and talking about the parables, and he talks about the size of a mustard seed. Most of us interact with mustard through a yellow bottle that says French's on it. We don't really see mustard seeds, but it would have been something incredibly important to people in the time period of Jesus. They would have known what a mustard seed was and how small that is compared to other things. So at this time period where it's written about the heart, it's not just eventually us understanding that the brain is going to be important. It's just written in words that were understandable and phrases and similes that were more understandable to people in this time. We'll go to the next one. So there was this discussion and argument that started to arise. We're going to leave Egypt, and I apologize, this is a super Euro-Western-centric conversation because there's not a lot of information that has been given to us about what happened in India and China and Africa and how they were thinking about these things. Because of so much of our history has come out of Europe and Western Europe in particular, I apologize, most of my conversation about this ancient time is going to be Western European, and I don't want to overlook that there is a whole wealth of information from the rest of the world that I'm just not going to cover. So we'll talk about Roman and Greek philosophers for just a few minutes, and then I'll move on. But Hippocrates came around. He was alive from 460 to 370 BCE, and he started to say, hey, I think the brain actually may be most important. I think that, this is actually the center of intelligence, willpower, and consciousness. And then Aristotle came around. So Aristotle, of course, had been with Socrates, and he said, no, the brain might be important for a little bit, but really it's the heart. The heart, we have it right. The heart is the most important thing. If you bleed, you die. But the brain must have some type of function, because we know if somebody gets hurt in their head, something happens. But he viewed the brain as a radiator, that when you got too boiled up, that the brain would just alleviate heat. And that was the whole purpose of the brain, was to alleviate heat. And this was really the major conversation that kept happening until Herophilus came along. And Herophilus was the father of anatomy, and he started to understand the knowledge of the perspective of the nervous system. And then Galen came around that same time, and Galen was a really influential Greco-Roman physician. He treated a lot of the injuries of the gladiators, and unfortunately I think he probably saw a lot of really unfortunate tragedies and some of the consequences of people who had been either sustained brain injuries or spinal cord injuries, and he had an appreciation of what might happen if somebody has a brain injury or spinal cord injury. And he started to do dissections on animals. So we were in a time in history where generally people were not dissecting humans. Most humans, when they died, it was because they had some type of disease. We did not know a lot about disease, so generally human bodies were buried very quickly based on religious tradition, or they were taken out of town. There was not a lot of autopsies done. There was not a lot of animal dissections done. So Galen was really one of the first people that was really starting to investigate this. So he would investigate sheep brains. So sheep brains, while they are four-legged animals, are remarkably similar to ours, which is kind of interesting. So he was looking at these brains, and he would take one out and he'd poke at it. And he decided that the cerebrum, which is what we normally look at when you think about a brain, is kind of the crinkly part on a human, that it's really soft. It's about the consistency of flan. So if you poke into it, it's really, I know, sorry. It's really kind of soft. And then there's this thing in the back called the cerebellum, and if you poke at it, it's really hard. So he said, I have it. The cerebrum must be the repository of memory because you can kind of stamp memories in there. And that the cerebellum is going to be more where we get our sensations, where we do movement. And it's interesting because he was kind of right. Even though he had the complete wrong way of going about that, he was kind of right in his conclusions. He then started going through and he looked at the brain and he realized that there were these big holes in it. And remember, modern thought had been the heart was really important because it flowed blood through it. So the brain must be important because of the holes, not because of the meat. So he concluded that the holes, which are called ventricles, must be the centers in which these vital fluids would go. And he had 4 different fluids we won't talk about, but they would get pumped through the heart and the liver and the lungs and the gut and then to the brain. And Galen's view prevailed for almost 1,500 years. So he wrote a medical textbook that people used for 1,500 years, and until Andreas Vesalius came through in 1514, he was born, and he started to actually change some things up. But still, the ventricular view was maintained, and we can see this in some of Leonardo da Vinci's art. So when he of course has a whole bunch of drawings and paintings that he's done, or drawings that he's done of human anatomy, and his drawings of the brain basically only show the eyeballs and the holes. So he doesn't show many of the other structures. If you go to the next slide, there's also been some scientists who have taken a look at some Michelangelo's work and have kind of suggested that maybe Michelangelo included some brain neuroanatomy hidden in some of his important works, including some of the Sistine Chapel. So here is one of the images from the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, where you have God pointing, reaching out to Adam, and this big thing behind him kind of looks like a brain. So it actually overlays brain neuroanatomy pretty well. The brainstem down here, the eyeball over here. If you look at the different picture and you look at the throat of God, the throat is weird on this. It doesn't look right, and it doesn't look consistent with any of the other throats that Michelangelo did. But it kind of looks like the brainstem. And if you overlay a drawing of the brainstem onto God, you can see the eyes, you can see the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So I can't say that that's actually what Michelangelo was doing, but it's kind of intriguing to think that there was starting to be an appreciation of some of the brain and some of this neuroanatomy. So really, it wasn't until the 17th century that we started to really look a lot more at the brain. In the 17th century, French inventors became interested. They started building hydraulic machinery, and they were looking at how that controlled mechanical devices. And this started to support the notion that the brain could actually be machine-like, and that it could actually work like hydraulics, where you have fluid that was being forced out of the ventricles through the nerves, literally pumping you up, creating you to do these actions. So René Descartes came along, and he was starting to write his influential book on man while he was trying to explain the behavior of animals and how humans might be similar to and a little bit distinct from humans. His book didn't come out until after death because he saw some of the impact of some of the things that was happening in the Catholic Church and how the Catholic Church had kind of responded to some of Galileo's work. So he ended up holding his book back from publishing, and once it was published, it was kind of impactful because he was, arguing that basically the human brain was interacting and creating our consciousness through its own works, so that the body was able to produce movements, it was able to produce sensations, it was able to produce its own thoughts without external sources. But then, because of some of the challenges of the Catholic Church, he then added in, or it's thought that he added in based on this, that there was some non-material soul that was interacting with the material body. He picked the pineal gland, which is a kind of curious place to pick as this location in which the soul interacted with the human body, because there was still this tension. So we now are starting to understand the human body as something that maybe is working without divine spirits coming through us. So how do you reconcile this feeling that we all have, the feeling of consciousness, the feeling uniqueness, if we don't have something to explain that, if it's all just that we're natural beings? So he said that this non-material soul would interact through the pineal gland. He probably picked it because it's one of the few things that there's a single one of in the brain instead of having everything in duals. And that non-material soul could exert influence over the human brain and body at the pineal gland. This introduced dualism, and that's why I said at the beginning, I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word soul and to imply that it's something separate from our body. I am more in line with modern neuroscientists and modern scientists, where I do believe that the body is producing its own thing and that we can interact with the divine spirit, but it doesn't have to be through a very specific portal in our body. So the end of the 18th century comes along, and people now have known they've now started dissecting bodies. Gross anatomy is described in detail, and we make a lot of progress. By the end of the 18th century, scientists understood that injury of the brain can cause some really big problems with sensations, movements. It can cause death. It can cause changes in consciousness. We now know that the brain is communicating to the body through nerves, so it has nothing to do with the bloodstream. That the brain is working somewhat like a machine, and it follows the laws of nature. So I won't go through who came up with each of those, but they now have some of this. They have a lot of the more fundamental things that we take for granted today. And the next 100 years, people learn more about the brain than they ever have in the entire thousands and thousands before that, which is kind of cool. So we now have Italian scientist Luigi Galvani, who comes in and says, hey, did you know this is actually working electricity, which is kind of cool, and the brain can generate its own electricity. A German zoologist, Theodor Schwann, comes through, and he says, hey, there's actually these cells in there. And then we come into a time period where people said, okay, well, if there's electricity, if there's cells, then there's probably some type of functional organization of the brain. And this was a time period where people were trying to figure out how the brain was organized and what was happening. And it became really fashionable to have this pseudoscientific belief in something called phrenology. And phrenology elaborated on the idea that the cerebrum, we talked about earlier, was somehow organized in a way that if you were to poke in certain areas or you had expansions in certain areas, that it would elicit some type of personality trait, or it would have some type of movement. So here is Franz Joseph Gall. This is one of his phrenology heads. If you go to a psychology department office, you're going to see one of these in probably every single faculty member's office. It's something that's a pseudoscience that we all kind of do a lot. And the idea is that, like our muscles, when you build them up, you can make them grow in size. If you have certain characteristics that are stronger, that part of your brain is going to be bigger, and if you're less inclined to something, it's going to be smaller. And then you can just rub the outside of your head, and your skull would tell you how well you are doing with that. It's a pseudoscience. It doesn't work. However, it is something that became really popular in culture, and even one of the previous queens had her shaved her head, and the Queens of England shaved her head and had her skull red, which I thought was kind of fun. But it did open us up to another type of neuroscience where we were starting to think about localization of function. So Paul Broca is really the one that we like to credit as neuroscientist as being kind of the person who came up with localization of function, because he's not associated with pseudoscience. He had a patient who came in who was not able to speak any longer, and after the patient died, he took his brain out and he saw there's a really big hole here. I don't know what normal brains look like, but you don't have holes like that in your brain. So he said, oh, there's a hole there. I bet that's what that does. This people who may know, is the area that's often affected by stroke. If you know somebody who's had a stroke and they lose their ability to speak fluently, that's the part of their brain that is missing. It's now called Broca's area after Paul Broca. So he came up with this idea of localization of function. I'm going to bring us into modern times, so I'm leaving the 1800s, we're going to come into the 2020s. We now use some of those principles of localization of function to merge with modern technology to allow scientists to study the brains of people who not have had necessarily injuries, but who actually are living, who may be functioning normally, and to ask questions about how the different parts of the brains work. So for decades, we were limited to understanding the brain by somebody who had an injury, somebody who had a stroke, something happened. We were able to document what happened and then go and look at their brains later and say, oh, well, this part must do this. Now we can have these different types of imaging programs that allow us to actually visualize the brain. This allows us to ask some really interesting questions. Now we can ask questions like, what happens when you pray? What happens if you ask somebody to talk to God? What happens if you stimulate this part of the brain? Where are we communicating with God? If we think that now the brain is the most important part, and we have brain scanning technology such as functional MRIs, where you can use magnets, you can put somebody into this tube, spin a magnet around, and it basically realigns some molecules in the brain in a non-harmful way, but it allows you to see where the brain is using the most energy. And you can kind of use some mathematical modeling, and you can kind of make some assumptions as to where these things are most active and where something might happen. So there are some scientists who, I'm going to show some controversial research, but there are some scientists who have asked these questions. So I'll let you go to the next slide. Dr. Andrew Nerberg, who is in the Department of Radiology at the University of Pennsylvania, was interested in this new field called neuroethology, which is like theology and neuroscience, so asking religious questions and trying to do brain scans. So he took some Franciscan nuns and he put them into a brain scanner and he asked them to pray. And they did a meditative centering prayer, and they basically were repeating this prayer, and he did a brain scan of them. And basically what you can see is that you have this baseline over here, so that this person is in prayer, this person is just being scanned, and then they're in prayer. And same thing's happening over here. This is their baseline, so nothing happening, and then they're in prayer over here. So these two are prayer conditions, these two are baseline. These are just different sections of the brain, different areas. But what we can see is that when this person's in prayer, we have a little bit more red in their scan here than we do over here. More red means more activity. So we see more activity in this area of the temporal lobe right about here. We also see more activity, or change in activity, sorry, reduction in activity, so more red in the baseline than in this area, in the parietal lobe. And we see a change in the frontal lobes. So we have these changes that we can see, so that we are thinking about, as this person, or his interpretation was that as the nuns are in prayer, that they are thinking and using some of their language centers, but then they also have this really interesting activation here that we really can't explain. So people who have seizures in this area right over here will often talk about hearing God and having God, feeling like they have a presence of God around them, or feeling like they, or feeling like that they, back one, sorry. Feeling like that they have God near them, and they'll talk about feeling God around them. So there's something special about this one area over in this part of our brain. This is a picture of Dr. Michael Persinger, who passed away in 2018. He was interested in stimulating this area. So what happens if we think this is the area that might allow us to experience God? What happens if you stimulate it? So he created what's called the God helmet, and it is a football helmet that basically has magnets on the inside of it, and it would stimulate this area. And it's controversial as to what his results say, but a lot of the people who experienced this would come out saying that they felt something around them. The language that they used was often consistent with whatever their beliefs were. So if it was somebody who was not religious, they may say that they feel aliens or an outer presence that they couldn't describe. If they are Christian, they would say that they feel God, the presence of God. There have been other people who have used other helmets that have said that they haven't felt that. The famous atheist Richard Dawkins put the helmet on, and he claimed that he didn't feel anything. So it's a little controversial about the God helmet. And so there have been people who have been trying to stimulate these ideas or stimulate these areas. There are also people who try to stimulate the brain through different substances. And we know that the brain is very sensitive to hallucinogenic substances, psychoactive substances, such as peyote, so aslant is the primary ingredient, psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms, DMT, which your brain can create, but really people kind of get it from frogs and some other things. So there are all these substances that people use and they give them hallucinogenic experiences that people will often also describe as having some type of transcendent or spiritual experience, especially depending on the location that they use it in or the situation they use it in. And if you look at these substances, a lot of them work on the serotonin system. So it works on a system that serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the brain, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. So these are working on the brain. And so there's some idea that we have some type of brain connection that allows us to at least feel spiritual transcendence, and that gives us some type of emergence of our own brain, or our own personality and our own consciousness. There was a book that was published quite a while now ago. It was called The God Gene. I don't know if anybody in here read that, but it was looking to see if there was a special gene in the brain or in the body that was to allow us to be more spiritual. And Dr. Hamer actually discovered that there is a variant in a vesicular monoamine transporter, which is part of the neurotransmitter system for dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, the same substances I was just talking about a minute ago, that in people who are more spiritual, they have one variant of this gene. People who are less spiritual have a different variant of that gene. So it's dubbed the God gene. It doesn't mean generally the people who are more spiritual are also, they are usually more also religious, but religion is kind of a cultural construct, and the type of religion often depends on what environment and culture you grew up in. But it's interesting to think that there is some type of spiritual gene that maybe we are made in some way to have these experiences and to have these beliefs. Because that's one of the things I think I'm most fascinated about, is that kind of throughout time in different cultures, we can point to some type of common spirituality. Maybe religions have changed over time, but there's this common need for higher power. There's this common need for understanding the world and for understanding that we can't answer all the questions ourselves, and that we have to look to other sources for all the answers because we are having a limited understanding. And even building upon centuries and centuries of previous knowledge, we still don't understand everything. So I think that's kind of the biggest point I wanted y'all to take away, is that, there's not necessarily, I don't see that there's a conflict between science and religion. It's all about asking the questions. It's all about being curious, having a wonder of the world around us and an awe and wanting to know more, and to then be able to think about, how do we ask these questions and how do we understand God's creation using the tools that he's given us. So I don't know, I hope that y'all enjoyed that. Sarah, if you want to go to the last one. Nobody asked any questions, so if y'all have questions or y'all have questions now, I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious about Lisa Miller's work and what you think. Lisa Miller at Columbia.
So what is her work? So I'm not familiar.
Okay, so she wrote The Awakened Brain, and so she's done a lot of fMRIs and regular MRIs and seeing structural differences, not only flow differences as a result of structural differences, and protective structural changes in the brain related to those who have spiritual beliefs. It's a great work.
I'm not familiar with her work. I was
the spiritual center. So that would be constant throughout generations.
So if you ask, I don't have the data with me, but there is, you hear often people